Masechet Gittin Daf Mem, we're talking about releasing a slave. We saw before that you can release him certainly by giving him a get, shichrur. We discussed whether if you release him monetarily by making him hefker, does that fully release him so he can get married or not? And now we're going to talk about if one treats his slave in a way of a free person, would that be a releasing, or at least an indication or proof that he had released him earlier? Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Amar Rav Asher, Amar Rabbi, Avid shenasa et bat horin bifnei rabo yasa leherut. So Rabbi Zera says in the name of Rabbi Chanina, in the name of Rav Asher. Now this can't be the regular Rav Asher, the 6th generation late Amora, because the Rabbi Zera is earlier than that, and so could not be quoting someone later than him. Rather, it could be an early Rav Asher, or if you look at manuscripts, they say either Rabbi Aseh or Rabbi Ameh. And so it's seems so it's definitely an earlier Amora that's quoting in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And he says that if a slave marries a free woman in front of the master, and the master doesn't say anything, right? If anyone has any objections, let them say it now. And the master sits at the wedding and participates and has no problem with it. Well, that shows that the master is viewing his slave as a free person. And so he is thereby emancipated. Now, it's not clear, does that act make him emancipated? Like, well, there was no act. It's just by sitting there and watching it. Can the master do this just by thought, or is it by actually doing the wedding? Is that an act of emancipating himself? Or rather, how most Rishonim say here, the fact that the master didn't say anything is proof that he had beforehand freed the slave. Okay, so no matter what, the point is that an Aved cannot marry a Bat Chorin while he's a slave. And so if he's marrying a Bat Chorin and the master doesn't object, that shows that, yes, he is a free man. Amar lo Rabbi Yochanan kol kach yesh biyadecha va'ani shoneh. Rabbi Yochanan is going to challenge Rabbi Zera's tradition here and says, oh, this is what you have in your hand, this halacha. I teach a halacha, I taught a halacha that is different from yours. And my halacha that I learned says, HaKotev shtar erusin l'shivchato, Rabbi Meir omer mekudeshet, Chachamim omrim ena mekudeshet. If a master writes to his shivcha a document of erusin, right? As he writes harat mekudeshet li, and he gives it to his own shivcha, right? He's betrothing, he's marrying his own shivcha, which is in a way even stronger than the previous case. The previous statement of Rabbi here was the master is just passive while he watches his slave get married, and here the master is actually active and marrying his slave. The master is a free person. So what does that mean? Machloket. Rabbi Meir says Mekudeshet, and that means that the maidservant is free, because if she wasn't free, the kiddushin wouldn't work. And so this act of giving her this shtar erusin is either an enactment or an indication that the master has freed her, and therefore it works as mekudeshet. That would be consistent with Rabbi. However, Chachamim say, ena mekudeshet. No, it doesn't work. There's no kiddushin here because she is still a maidservant. She was never freed. It doesn't work. Okay, now if you look at this in a simple reading, it looks like Rabbi, that's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, 5th generation, is the same as Rabbi Meir. Both of them say that the servant is free. And that would actually make sense because Rabbi is a student of Rabbi Meir. Meir is the 4th generation student of Rabbi Akiva, the 3rd generation. And so they could be arguing with Chachamim. And in fact, if you look at the Talmud Yerushalmi parallel here, it doesn't quote this in the name of Rabbi, but rather a different Tana. But the Talmud Yerushalmi does say, it does have a very similar statement to that of Rabbi Yochanan here. And so that Tana would be the same as Rabbi Meir. It would be in a Dat Yachid. Okay, so that's the simple reading here, is that according to the Dat Yachid, Rabbi Meir, and the other statement that's quoted in both the Bavli and Yerushalmi by Rabbi Chanina, would say that a marriage act is a indication of freedom, and Chachamim say it's not. However, the Bavli does not go in that path. because the Bavli wants Rabbi, right, whoever is the author of that first statement, by Rabbi Chanina, to be in accordance with Chachamim. And so here's the problem. How could what is he going to follow the Rabbi Meir individual opinion? He should follow the majority opinion. So how are we going to answer this? By making it okimta on the case of Rabbi. Kedamar Rav Shela kesherabo haniach lo tefillin, hachadame kesherabo hisio isha. So we're going to use an answer, we're borrowing an answer that Rav Shela says. We're going to see his context in a minute. That he says, answering another question, that it's when the master puts tefillin on his slave. Now, a slave, Eved Knaani, once he becomes a slave, is chayav b'mitzvot, and the same way that women are chayavot b'mitzvot, which means they are piturim from wearing tefillin. Now, they can wear tefillin, a woman can wear tefillin, there's no prohibition against her wearing tefillin, but she generally doesn't, and the same thing with Eved Kanaani, he could wear a tefillin, but generally he doesn't. Since he generally doesn't, if he does wear tefillin, and particularly if his master puts tefillin on his slave, that is an indication that the slave is free, because the master is doing something active. And therefore here we reinterpret Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's case to say that it's when the master performs a marriage, provides a wife for him. The master says, hey, slave, come here and marry this free woman. And it's because he's doing something active, that's why that's why it works. Okay, so that in that case there's no contradiction here, because when the master himself does kiddushin with his servant, then Chachamim say ena mikudeshet, that's no good. But when he is actively marrying his servant off to another free woman, then that is an indication. All right, so that answers, that the B is like Chachamim, not like Rabbi Meir, but then it creates another contradiction. Like how do we reconcile these two cases? Does it make sense that a master for his servant would not do an isur? There's an isur for a servant, a slave, to marry a free person. Doesn't matter who's the man and who's the woman, right? It's not allowed. So when the master is marrying off his slave, right? That's the statement here. We assume that the master would not violate a law and marry off his servant to a free person. Therefore, we say it's indication that he has freed his slave. Okay, because he wouldn't do an isur. Okay, but the master himself would do an isur, because according to Chachamim, and this is how we're trying to reconcile it, according to Chachamim, if the master himself marries his own maidservant, we say ena mikudeshet, because we assume that he did not make her free. He just tried to marry her as a maidservant, and thereby as actually violating a law, and that's why she's not free. She is not free, and the kiddushin does not work. So this doesn't add up, because why would he assume that he's violating an isur and not freeing her when he himself marries her, but he would not violate an isur and is freeing his slave when he's marrying off his servant to someone else? That's the question. Amar Rav Nachman B'Yitzchak, Kacha Ma'Iskinan, Damar La, Se'i Bo V'Hitkadeshi Bo. Rabbi Meir Sabar Yesh Balashon Hazeh Lashon Shichrur, V'Rabbanan Sabri, and Balashon Hazeh Lashon Shichrur. So Rav Nachman B'Yitzchak comes and explains that we're talking about a case where the master says to his maidservant who he's trying to marry, Se'ibo, leave with this, right? Which, does that mean become free, or what does that mean? It's not the usual language of hishtachreribo. So through this you will leave, be emancipated or something, and this will also be your kiddushin. So it's an ambiguous term. The master has in mind that he does want to marry her legally, but the question is, does this terminology accomplish it? Rabbi Meir says, yes, se'ibo, it means shichrur, see, leave, meaning don't be a slave anymore. And so that's fine. That's why it works. Rabbanan say, no, see, sorry, it doesn't mean shichrur, and therefore it's just a technicality of the language that you used. If you said hishtachriri bo v'tkadeshi bo, certainly that would be good. But if you say see bo, that doesn't mean shichrur, and that's why it's no good. And so now we can reconcile all the opinions. It'll be here, even though it doesn't fit with the simple pashat of the wording, Evishanasa bat chorin bifnei rabo, we interpret this to mean that the master was actively involved in marrying and arranging a marriage for his servant with a free person. In that case, we say, yes, that's certainly an indication that he has freed her. But in the case where the master himself marries her, but uses language that is problematic, that's why Chachamim say, "Ena mekudeshet," because he said "sei." Okay, now Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, "Ebed sheniach tefillin bifnei rabo yasa lecherut." Okay, now back to the tefillin. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says that a servant who himself puts on tefillin and he does it in front of the master, and the master does not object, that means that's an indication that he is free. Because, again, while an Eved Kanani can put on tefillin, since he usually doesn't, maybe unless he's a very pious Eved Kanani that always wants to, if he usually doesn't, and now he's doing it, that shows that he thinks he's free. So if the master would object and say, "Hey, what are you doing? You can't do that, right? You're a servant," then he would not. But if he does it in front of his master and the master doesn't say anything, so that shows that he is free. Metiveh, we challenge Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Lava hemenu rabo, o she'asao rabo apotropos, o she'nech tefillin bifnei rabo, o she'kara shelosha pesukim bet haknes bifnei rabo, harei zeh lo yasa lecherut. According to this braita, if a master does any of these things, treating his slave like a free person, for example, if the master borrows money from his own slave, just treating him like a free person, or he makes the master makes his slave into a steward to be in charge. Here, you'll be in charge of this section of the business. Well, that's treating him like a free person. Or if the master puts tefillin, or if the servant puts on tefillin in front of his master, or if the servant gets an aliyah, he reads 3 pesukim in Bet Knesset in front of the master. Generally, slaves would not get an aliyah. And again, here, technically, one could. He could get an aliyah, like Nashim, Ketanim, but generally it didn't happen. So if he went and got an aliyah and the master was there and didn't say anything, that's all these could be indications. But this Baraita says, Lo yasad lecherut. This is not sufficient to make the person free. Right? These are all too weak. I mean, they are somewhat indications, but not necessarily, because it could be that he puts on tefillin, it could be that he gets an aliyah, could be that he borrows, could be that he makes a slave, even as a slave, into apotropos. And so therefore, these are not strong enough indications. So now we have a contradiction. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, it is an indication, putting on tefillin in front of his master, and he goes free. And the Baraita says, not so. And here we have the resolution. Amar Rabba bar Rav Shela kishrabo hiniach lo tefillin. Oh no, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, even though his language didn't say so explicitly, he is only talking about when the master actively puts on tefillin upon his servant. That shows that he is treating him like a free person, and therefore he is a free person. But the master has to be active, and the problem in this baraita is that these are more passive. The master just is not objecting. And so that's how we resolve that question. Good. Okay, next. We're going to see two versions of what Rabbi Yochanan said. Rabbi Yochanan is from Eretz Yisrael, and then these are two sages that bring the tradition from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. So one is by Rav Dimi. Remember this because we're going to quote this in a few minutes. Mi shamar bishat mitato pilonit shivchati al yishtabedu ba'al acharei moti. Someone says at the time that he's going to die, he's on his deathbed, and he says, this person, my maidservant, I don't want her to mishtabed after I die. Now, what does this language mean? It sounds like he's saying, I don't want her to be a slave. Or does he mean, I don't want her to be worked as a slave? Okay, he doesn't say it explicitly, I want her to be freed. But something like this, I don't want her to be enslaved anymore, treated as a slave anymore. So what should we do? After he dies, the Bet Din will come and force the inheritors to write her a get shichrur, because that was the wishes of the master of the father. Amru lefanav Rabbi Ameh v'Rabbi Aseh, Rabbi, ahi ata modeh shebaneha avadim. However, Rabbi Ameh and Rabbi Aseh objected to this tradition that Rav Dimi quoted in Rabbi Yochanan, and they say, wait, well, don't you agree that her children should be avadim? In other words, Rabbi Ameh and Rabbi Aseh interpret this language al yishtat bedu, not that the first master who's dying wanted to free her, because if you free her, then that's it. All her future children will be free also. But rather that he just wanted to make her not have to work, right? She worked hard and my whole life. She served me well. And now I don't want her to have to work as a slave anymore. But that doesn't say that he said that she has to be freed, right? And so the heirs can say, well, listen, fine, we won't give her any chores to do, but if she has children, we want those children to be slaves. And so we want to keep her as a slave. And so this is Rabbi Ameh and Rabbi Aseh object. And they say this language just means that she should not work, but she can remain a slave. Okay, that's version 1. Ki ata Rav Shemuel bar Yehuda amar Rabbi Yochanan. So second version of Rabbi Yochanan. Mi shamar bishat mitato. Pelonit shivchati korat ruach astali. Yaseh la korat ruach. This guy, according to this version, the guy on his deathbed said, this shivcha of mine, and says her name, she gave me satisfaction. She did everything. She cooked, she cleaned, she served me very well. And therefore, she should have satisfaction done to her. Now, he's leaving it more ambiguous, so that's not clear what exactly he wants his heirs to do. So what do? Kofin et Yerushin v'osin la korat ruach. So we force the Yerushin to do whatever will give her satisfaction. We ask her, right? What would you like? Would you like to be freed? If she says, yes, I want to be freed, that will give you satisfaction, then have to free her. If she says, no, I want to stay and living in the house and be a slave status, but no chores, and then we'll do that. We'll do whatever she wants. We will have to do. My tama misvah came to Vidamet. Right? Why do they have to do it? Because there's a general rule that you have to fulfill the statement of a dead, someone on his deathbed. Their words are taken very seriously, and therefore we should fulfill them. In this version, there is no objection of Rabbi Ameh and Rabbi Aseh, right? They only object to this mi'ishta bedu language, that this sounds like don't make her work, but doesn't mean free her. But in the second version, well, then you have to do whatever she says, and if she wants to be free, then you have to free her. Amar Amemar. Okay, now we're going to see two versions of what Amemar said. This statement of Amemar we quoted in a snippet form on the previous daf, but this is actually the source of it. The structure of this sugya is very interesting, because we have two versions of Rabbi Yochanan, then two versions of Amemar, but they're going to interlink, because we're going to use the versions of Rabbi Yochanan to answer a question about Amemar. Okay, so let's see. Amar Amemar, hamafkir avdo, Oto Eved en lo takana. Mai ta'ama. Kufe la kanela isurahu de'ika gabe. Visura la maseh makni la. Amemar said, if someone renounces ownership of his slave, this is a problem, because he only renounced the monetary aspect, but not the prohibition aspect, right? The owner, when he is a full owner of the slave, he owns the slave monetarily, and also that ownership makes the slave prohibited from marrying a free person. But Amemar says these are two separate levels, and if he just does hefker, then he goes free monetarily. But he still cannot get married, and there's no way to help this Eved become free totally and marry. Why? Because Gufeh, the owner, now no longer owns his body monetarily, but the prohibition is still retained by the master. The problem is he can no longer give a get, but he can no longer release the prohibition status of the get, because he doesn't own the slave monetarily, right? So it's kind of a paradox. If he owns him monetarily, then he has a right over him, and he can give him a get shichrur and then fully free him. But once he half frees him and gives up the monetary value, so now he no longer has that access to free the slave in his prohibitions. Like he lost the password, right? He has lost the connection, but the problem is the slave still has the prohibition upon him. And so that's what Amemar says in this first version. Okay, in this version we're going to ask, Amar le Rav Asher le Amemar, V'amar Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan, V'Rav Chiya bar Avin Amar Rav. Rav Asher is going to challenge Amemar from a statement that we've seen a couple of dapim ago in the name of both Rabbi Yochanan and in the name of Rav. Rav said that if someone is mafkir his slave or makdish his slave, either way, that works to release him monetarily. But he still needs a get shichrur. This is a challenge because, according to this statement by Rabbi Yochanan and by Rav, even after you make the slave hefker, you can still give a get shichrur. I mean, so they agree that they are separable connections, right? The separate levels, but that even after the master releases the slave monetarily, he can still go ahead and give a get. This is against Amemad that says once he releases him monetarily, he loses his connection and can no longer give a get. How can you reconcile this? And the answer is Amaleh Sarich ve'eno takana. Amemad can interpret this as he needs a get, but he can't get a get, right? He cannot marry unless he has a get, but the master, who no longer owns him, has no authority to give him a get anymore. So yes, sarich doesn't mean that he needs it, but he can now no longer accomplish this. So it is impossible to reconcile. All that was one version of Amemad, and this did not yet involve the two versions of Rabbi Yochanan. The next version of Amemad is going to. Ika da amre amar Amemar. Hamafkir avdo umet. This is the new. All right, we're adding that he died. So some guy, let's say a father, owns a slave, and he renounces ownership over him. And then that father dies, and now the son takes over. What happens to the slave? Oto eved en lo takana. In that case, the eved is stuck and can never get married. Maitama gufela kanile isurahu deika gabe visura libre lo la moret, because the body of the slave, the monetary part of it, does not belong to the master, not the father, not the son. The master renounced it. But there is still a prohibition from the master. The master owns the slave to the extent that the slave is still prohibited from marrying a free person. But the isur part of it does not go to his son. It does not inherited by the son. So according to this version, if the father was alive and the father renounced ownership, made his slave hefker, the father still could give a get shichrur, right? Because the father owns both. He owns both levels separate. They are separable. So the father took care of one level, the monetary. He could still take care of the other level and release the prohibition. So the father can do both of them, and so therefore we're not going to ask over here from Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, because yes, there would be full agreement. The father can still give a get shichrur. The problem is the son. Because there's no more monetary ownership, so the son inherits only monetary things. So it's not going to inherit the slave at all, and therefore there is no one around, no one left that can give a get shichrur. And it's in this case that Amemar says that the slave is stuck. Amar le Rav Asher le Memar. Rav Asher now is going to challenge. Again, it was Rav Asher in the first version, and here Rav Asher also is challenging Amemar, but this time from a different statement. Vaha ki ata Rav Dimi amar Rabbi Yochanan. What about the statement that Rav Dimi said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan? We're talking about this statement here above, where he said that when someone dies, this is why it's a similar case. Someone dies and says, I don't want my servant, this shivcha, to be enslaved anymore, be treated as a slave anymore. So we force the Yoshim, and they write her a get shichrur. So you see here that the sons can write a get shichrur, and the Memad, you said that the sons cannot write a get shichrur. Okay, we're assuming that in this case, that when the father, the one who about to die, says she should not be a slave anymore, that statement by itself is releasing her monetarily, like hefker, and then the sons finish it off and give her a get shichrur so that she can go get remarried. So this is indeed the opposite of what Amemar says. Derav dimi ta'utahi. So Amemar could say oh no, Rav Dimi, his version was a mistake. Right, Rav Dimi's version of Rabbi Yochanan was a mistake. After all, we're about to see, right, that after all, Rav Shemuel has a different version of Rabbi Yochanan, and furthermore, Rabbi Aseh said, challenged Rav Dimi, right, and said, "Oh, what? Don't you agree that the son should keep him so that they can still have the children of the maidservant?" And so they say, no, you don't have to free her in this case. So you see that Dimi's version of Rabbi Yochanan and his interpretation of Rabbi Yochanan is incorrect. So therefore, I don't have to answer that question. That's what Memar says. But then Rav Ashi says further, Amar le, my ta'uta. Wait a second. What was the challenge against Rav Dimi by the Bi'ameh Rabbi Aseh? Tela amara bilshon shichrur. Ha amara bilshon shichrur hachanameh. Their challenge was that what was only that al yishtabedu does not mean shichrur. And so he says, therefore the father only meant to say, don't give her chores anymore. And so, fine, we won't give her chores, but it doesn't mean that the children have to free her, because they may want to keep her as a servant, so they can have the children of the maidservant to be slaves. But if the father had said, Hishtachriri ota leachar moti, then the children would be able to give her a get, and so therefore we renew our challenge. This is a good challenge by Rav Ashi against Amemar. Amemar says, Ana ked Rav Shemuel bar Yehuda sevir ali. He says, I don't agree with that whole version of Rabbi Yochanan, right? That's this whole version is a mistake. I follow Rav Shemuel bar Yehuda's version, and therefore I don't have to answer your question at all. In this version, the father did not actually free the slave at all, right? He just said, do what's pleasing to her. So since the slave was not freed on any level, and so it's fully inherited by the children, and therefore the children should fulfill their father's wishes and free her. But the children can do that because they have monetary ownership, because they inherit the monetary ownership. Because the father didn't say, Hishtachari, she is... or hishtachriri or al yishtabedu, because that language sounds like the father already is releasing her monetarily, and then that would be a problem, because then the sons could not inherit and then would not be able to give her get shichrut. But in the second version, the father didn't say anything, not hishtachriri, not la yishtabedu, just do what's pleasing, and so therefore she is still fully a slave when the father dies, and the sons fully inherit, and therefore the sons can go ahead and give her a get shichrut. So that's consistent with Amemar. Amemar only had a problem when the father makes her hefker. Okay, now a story. Hahu diskarta de avde de izdaban legoy. Kalu marvata batrae atu lekame de ravina. So there was a city or an area of slaves. These are Eved Kanaanim that were sold to a non-Jews, right? So you had Jews that had acquired these Eved Kanaani, but sold them. So when they sold them, they sold the monetary right over them. However, they were not freed totally, so they still have a status of Eved Kanaani in the sense that they cannot marry a Jew. Okay, so now these Gentiles have ownership over them, but then these Gentile masters died, and now what are we going to do with them, right? How can we allow them to become totally free so they can marry? So they came to Ravina to ask him. Amar lehu zilu ahadru abene marvata kamae v'ichtebu lechu gita de haruta. So he says, go and look for your original Jewish masters, or the sons of them, because they already died, and let them write get shichrut for you. So you see, this would not follow Amemar. So the rabbi said to Ravina, hold on, this goes against Amemar, because Amemar says that if a father freed his slave or renounced ownership over the slave, and this case would be the same because they sold their slave, so now he no longer has monetary ownership over the slave, and then dies, then the sons have no right to give a get shichrut. So this is a problem for us here. And so Ravina says, Ana amar lehu ana Rav Dimi sevir ali. I don't agree with Memar. I agree with Rav Dimi that's the first version, that when the father says, I don't want my maidservant to be servant anymore, and then dies, even though they're freed monetarily, the son still can write a get. But then they said, wait, but didn't we learn that Avdimi's version is a mistake, right? To be amen, to be aseh. They challenged it, and they said, no, you can't do that. The father didn't mean to free him totally, not just that she shouldn't have chores, but her children should still be slaves. Says, no, that was a mistake. It's just that in that case, Rabbi Ameh and Rabbi Aseh interpreted the words differently. And they said, since he didn't say hishtachriri, but rather al tishta'bedi, so since the master didn't say in the language of emancipation, that's why the Rabbi Ameh and Rabbi Aseh said, no, we disagree, and you know what? With Rav Dimi's interpretation of the words, and therefore they can keep her as a slave so that they can have the children. But even they would agree that if the father had said, emancipate my maidservant, then the sons would be able to give a get, even though the father already emancipated her monetarily. The sons could follow through and give a get. And so therefore Ravina follows that version, and Hilchataki Ravina, the halacha follows Ravina, that in fact you can split the two stages even between the father and the son. The father can do a monetary freedom, and the sons can still give a get shichrur, and this is against Amemar. Okay, now another story. Hu Abda, this is a story that's not related halachically to the previous part. But it is just related in its theme. You have two people that own a slave together, right? It's a partnership, 50-50 partnership in the slave. And one of them goes in and frees his share of the slave. So now you have someone who's half free and half slave. Now the rabbis did not want this. We're going to see in the Mishnah on the next stop that the rabbis would force the other partner to free the person, because you can't have this poor guy who cannot marry a free person, cannot marry a slave, because they're half-half. So they would come and force the other party to also free his half and get compensation, but still you have to free him. So so this other party that still owns half a slave knows this halacha and says, oh, the rabbis are going to hear about it, and they're going to force me to release my half, and I don't want to release it. So I have a good way of protecting my assets. I'm going to transfer them to a foreign country. So no, in this case, he's going to transfer it to his minor son. And now a minor son can't be forced to come to court and do anything. He's a minor. And that way I'll buy myself time till he grows up. They won't be able to force my son to emancipate the slave, and that way we'll still have the slave owned within the family, and we can work him every other day. So this case came to Rav Yosef, and he says, this is complicated. What do I do with this wise guy who's trying to protect his slave asset that he's supposed to free? So they asked the Rav Yosef, the son of Rava, asked Rav Papa, and sent him the question. Shalach leh, and Rav Papa responded, Kasher asa ken ya'aseh lo gimo lo yashib lo berosho. Quoting Pesukim, as he did, so shall it be done to him. Right? His dealing shall return to his own head. This guy's a wise guy. We're going to treat him in the same way, and we'll find legal loopholes to make him sell his half of the slave. How are we going to do that? We know that children, they are attracted to money. A few coins, right? You dangle a few coins in front of them, even if it's a little bit, the kids don't know the true value, and they're like, oh yeah, I want that money. I want to go buy bubble gum with it in the machine. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to appoint a steward. The child can't effectuate legal transactions on his own. You need a steward that will work on his behalf, and if when they do free the slave, you want to get the market value so that they can get so that he can get paid the correct amount, not cheated. We're not looking to cheat the kid. So we'll go to the kid and to the child. We'll jingle some coins in front of him, and the kid will say, and we'll ask him, hey, do you want these coins, or and to free the slave? He says, oh yeah, I really want the coins. What does the kid need a slave for? And so he'll take the slave, and he'll take the coins and agree to sell the slave, and then the apotropos will go and get the market price, and will be able to write a get of emancipation in his name, in the name of the child. And so that's what they did, even though this is kind of a roundabout way of kind of taking advantage of a child's innocence. Not knowing, his full rights, to convince him to sell the slave, but that's fine, because really the father should have sold the slave, and he thinks if he thinks he's going to be able to protect his assets in this way, he's wrong. We're going to get the assets out of him anyway. Okay, now we have a few other just random halachot about the language that one uses when freeing a slave, and we're going to compare that to language one uses when giving property over to someone else. Tenora banan. Hamed asiti ploni avdi ben chorin. Asui ben chorin. Harehu ben chorin. Harehu ben chorin. If someone says, I made my slave a free person, or my slave was made a free person, or behold, he is a free person, those are all good statements, formulas to make him a free person, and he's free. However, he says, Asenu ben chorin. He says, uses a future. All these were just a present tense or past tense. But if it says future, I am going to make my slave free. Rabbi Omer, Kana. Rabbi says it works, because what his point is that in all these cases he's writing this. You can't say it orally. So he's writing this in a shtar, and what he means is, by giving this get, I will be making him free. He's writing it now because he's going to give it in a few minutes. So Rabbi says, yes, the slave has acquired his freedom. Chachamim say no, it doesn't. It says in the future. Maybe that means next year. It doesn't mean that he already did it. Okay. Amar Rabbi Yochanan clarifies that all of this language cannot be done orally. You can't free a slave orally. It means that you wrote it in a document. Asiti piloni avdi ben chorin. You write that document. You give it to the slave. That's how he goes free. Tenora banan. Hamen natati sadeh pelonit lefloni netuna lefloni harehi shelo. If someone says, I gave rights in a document, I gave this field to this person, or it is given to this person, or behold, it is his. Yes, all those formulas work to give a gift of land to someone else. However, in the future, at tenena lifloni Rabbi Meir omed kana, chamim omrim lo kana, Rabbi Yochanan v'cholan bishtar. Rabbi Meir says that works, because I'm writing it now. I am going to give this field to someone else, and then I give him the document, so that is a proper document, even though it's in the future, because I wrote it just a few minutes ago talking about this point when I give it to him. Hachamim say no, in the future could mean next year, so therefore it is not acquired. And Rabbi Yochanan says again here, you cannot effectuate a transaction just orally. It doesn't work. But it says, this is yours, it doesn't mean it's yours. Yeah, to acquire a field, there's various ways, but one of them is with a shtar, so you have to actually give a shtar over, and then that will effectuate the transaction. Good. Tenor banan. Ha omer asiti peloni abdi ben chorin. V'hu omer lo asa'ani. Hashinan shemazika lo ayede acher. If the master says, I made this person who was my slave free, so the master claims that he freed his slave, but the slave says, no, he never did that. He denies it. So it's kind of curious, because that the slave, wouldn't say, yes, he did. We figure he wanted to go free. But maybe the slave just is saying, maybe the master meant to, but he never did it. He never actually gave me a get. And he has to give me a get again. The slave, actually wants halachically to be free. And he says, no, he never did it for me. In this case, who do we believe, the master or the slave? So the answer is we believe the master, because maybe the slave doesn't know that he was freed. Maybe the master, zika lo ayideh acher, the master can give the get to the slave directly, but the master can also give it to a third party and say, here, and acquire this on behalf of the slave. Zachin la'adam shelo befanav, and it's a good thing not to be a slave, and therefore, he can give it to someone else on behalf of the slave. And so the slave might have been emancipated without knowing, and therefore the owner knows better. So we believe the owner, and we said, no, sorry, you know, for better or for worse, you are free, whatever you want it to be. Okay, katavti v'natati lo. However, if the master says, I wrote it and I gave it to you, the slave. The slave denies this. No, he did not write it and he never gave it to me. I never received anything. So now this is different from the previous case, because now the slave would know if he received it. In this case we say, Hoda'at ba'aldin kemea edim dameh. The testimony of the litigant himself is like 100 witnesses. And in this case we're focusing on the litigant, meaning the servant who is saying something that's against his self-interest, right? He's kind of admitting that I am not free. So if he admits he's not free, which is against his self-interest, then that's like 100 witnesses, and he is believed over the master. And then if he still wants to be free, then we have to tell the master, okay, you know what, you have to do it again. Because he denies ever having received this document. Okay, ha'omer natati sadeh peloni lifloni. Same parallel thing regarding giving land. If someone says, I gave this land to someone else, v'hu omer lo natani, but the recipient of the gift says, no, I never gave it to me. Hashinan shemazika lo ayedei acher. So then we say, we believe the giver, because maybe the giver didn't give it directly to the recipient, maybe he gave it to a third party. Zachin le'adam shelo befanav. And so we assume that it is transferred over. And this would affect many halachot, like if who is responsible if something happens on the land, or who enjoys the produce of the land. Now, katavti v'natati lo, v'hu omer lo katav v'lo natani, hodat ba'aldin kemea edim dameh. If the sender, the giver, says, I wrote a document and I gave it to him personally, and the recipient says, no, he never wrote it, he never gave it to me, in this case we invoke the rule that the admission of a litigant is like 100 witnesses. You could say like 2 witnesses, because 2 and 100 are the same. The point is, if someone is admitting something against his self-interest and saying, no, that he never gave me the land, then he is believed. And so we assume that the transaction never happened. Mi ochel perot. Now we ask, in this kind of case, who would get the produce? Because in a case where the recipient says, I never received anything, and so we assume it belongs to the giver, that same last case. Rav Chisda amar noten ochel perot. So simply, the giver gets the produce because the recipient says he never gave me a document, and we believe him because hodat ba'aldin. And so the giver retains the produce. Rabbah amar meshal leshin et haperot. However, Rabbah says, no, since it's disputed, give it to a third party until you can put an escrow in the third party, until you can figure out with some other proof who the land belonged to during that period. Okay, now even though it looks like it's a machloket here, v'la pelege ha be'aba ha bebra. They are actually not arguing when the Rav Chisda says that the giver keeps all the produce. That's when the receiver is still alive. And the receiver says, I didn't receive any gift, so then we know we believe him, and so therefore the giver of the gift keeps it. However, once that person, the receiver, dies, and now it goes to everything he owns goes to his son, who inherits him. Now the son doesn't know for sure whether the father received a gift or not. The son wasn't there. He doesn't know. He wasn't with his father every second. And so since the son does not know, we cannot invoke Hoda'at Ba'aldin Kema'adim Dameh regarding the son. And that's the case that Rabbah was talking about, that since the giver says, I wrote and gave a document to your father. The son says, I have no knowledge of my father ever receiving it, but he doesn't know. And so therefore, we don't know who to believe, and therefore we put it in escrow. That's what Rabbah is talking about, until we can determine who the rightful owner is. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.